Hey Tom, how you doing?
I'm good, Matt. I'm covered in mosquito bites from the Netherlands. Hence why I have like a band-aid on my arm.
That balmy tropical paradise of Holland.
It was like 30 degrees when I was there last weekend, and slowly dying of the heat, and had to sleep with the windows open in the hotel. So I've been eaten alive.
You're a pasty Irish man unsuited to hot weather.
I'm good with hot weather. It's just that my blood is too sweet. They obviously just want a
I've
piece
heard
of me.
that about you. I heard that about you. I think I read it somewhere.
Oh God, I don't want to know.
Maybe on a toilet wall.
Maybe. But Matt,
I'm excited for today. Yeah,
you're absolutely beaming. I don't think I've ever seen you as excited to record an episode.
I'm a fanboy, and the person we're talking to today was like one of the first people who made me realize that I could do this job, frankly. So I'm 20 odd years in the making fanboy. So I'm really happy to be doing this interview today. Welcome to Beneath the Skin, Margot Mifflin.
Thanks so much. I'm a fangirl myself of all you've done, and thrilled to be here.
Honestly, I couldn't have done it without you.
That's fabulous to know. It's really nice.
Matt, we were so excited we forgot to even intro the show.
Well, I was trying to intro there. I'm very pro.
Yeah. Beneath Skin show about the history of everything, told through the history of tattooing. I'm one of your co-hosts, Thomas Manny, and I'm joined as ever by my esteemed co-host, Dr. Matt Lauder. Okay, we've done that. Back
Activation phrase. I don't. Maybe do you want to just give us a quick intro about who you are, Margot, and what your current kind of thing is, your job, your current kind of projects are, and then we can kind of rewind a bit, maybe.
Okay, sure. So I'm a writer and a professor. I teach at the City University of New York. Was hired to teach journalism. I'm a journalist, but I teach in an English department. And my books, two of them have been tattoo history. First, Bodies of Subversion, A Secret History of Women in Tattoo from 1997. And then the book that grew out of that was a biography of Olive Oatman. And then I moved on to books that don't really relate to tattoo, although they do relate to women and women's themes and the body. The most recent book is A Cultural History of the Miss America pageant.
Yeah, I haven't got around to reading that yet, but it's on my summer reading list.
Thanks.
I almost count Bodies of Subversion as two books, right? Because I think like the second edition is so brilliantly updated, and there's so much extra material in the second edition. So I'd count Bodies of Subversion as two books, and so I think you've written 3 books about tattooing, not just 2.
It's true, and they were updated. I guess it was 3 times, but you're right. The second one just folded in a lot more, and the photos are better, and the design was better. So that I am always a little dismayed when I see the old one still selling on Amazon.
So how did you become, so you're a journalist by training, how did you get interested in tattooing in the first place?
I was writing about the visual arts and performance art, and I was really interested in feminist art, often, performance art that had to do with the body. And I was getting a little bit disillusioned with the blue chip art world and the elitism of it and the male dominance of it. So I just started looking around for other art forms that were more folk forms and more democratic or demotic, I guess is the word. And I was struck by the fact that a number of people around me were getting tattooed. And I had played in bands in the 80s, so I saw people in the music world who were tattooed. And in retrospect, at the time, it was journalistically interesting to me, but I was just thinking about this recently. I don't think I realized till recently how much it really did intersect with the feminist body art I was focused on at the time.
And you were in New York at the time, weren't you? Still,
yes.
So that was at a time when tattooing was just at the end of becoming, or at the beginning of becoming legal again in New York, right? So a really interesting time for tattooing in New York, let alone tattooing in general.
Yes, and also really interesting for women because it was a time when there had been enough generations of women and like a volume of women starting to tattoo that there were women teaching other women, and a whole like trackable history developing.
Yeah.
And women doing specific things with tattooing that related to women's fashion, women's bodies, women's experience.
Yeah, I went back and reread Bodies of the First Edition recently as I was putting my new book together, and I was really kind of struck by exactly that story of the way you made sense of it all, which is you have this small group of women in the 70s and 80s, and then by the time the 90s are happening, things are really kind of at some kind of volume where you can start to make sense of it as a set of phenomena, right, rather than as a series just of interesting individuals that it had been beforehand.
Yeah, and it struck me that there were all these women tattooing and talking about the body and using tattoos in a way specific to women, and not as well. Some people were just doing straight up tattooing, but that their world didn't really intersect with the world of feminist body artists. And I mean, I think there's a lot more overlap in those worlds today than there is now, and generally between the art world and the tattoo world. But it seemed very divided. And maybe a couple, like Ruth Martin was someone who was tattooing, but also had a foot in the art world. And she was an illustrator, and now is a full-time illustrator who moved out of tattoo, but did very interesting things.
I think it's kind of interesting that Ruth Martin stopped being a tattoo artist. Probably because of those things you're talking about, right?
Yeah, and I'm not exactly sure. I interviewed her twice, once for the first edition and then again, and I don't remember what she said about that. I think maybe it was that it was hard to make a living as a tattooist, and so she was doing well with illustration, and she just went ahead with that.
Yeah. So had you been tattooed before you got interested in this stuff journalistically, or have you been? I don't even know if you have any tattoos. Actually, thinking about it now,
no, I don't actually. It's interesting. People always ask this. It's sort of a dual answer. When I started, I was interested in it as an art form, and I, as a journalist, thought, like, I kept discovering people and saying, like, that's the person I would get tattooed by. But journalistically, I thought, like, I need to keep a distance because I'm reporting on this from outside. Although I guess if I were an anthropologist, it would be probably just the opposite. But then, like, these waves of tattoo trends would happen, and I would think, God, I'm so glad I didn't get that tattoo that I wanted 4 years ago. So the reason I'm not tattooed is that, and also being a chronically indecisive person. I fixate on something, want it, and then I'm uncertain. However, in the past couple of years, my daughter, who's tattooed and who does some tattooing, a few years ago, she and I agreed to get tattooed. And the problem was we wanted different styles. Like, I love black and gray. She likes color. So we've kind of come together and found a pretty good intersection of what we could do. Because the idea was to like get the same thing or complementary things. I think we're going to forget that and just get what we each want.
I think because I think also my other early influence in terms of like really interesting and good quality writing about tattooing was Jane Kaplan, and she also wasn't tattooed when she started writing about it.
Oh, but she went. But I remember that book.
She went and got tattooed by Alex Binney, and I think she only got tattooed once. I think like Binney was enough for her.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that book was fantastic. I reviewed that for the Village Voice, and I will say that if I had the opportunity right now, it would be Rox, who I would get tattooed by.
Oh yeah,
who's the cover, whose tattoo is on the cover of Bodies of Subversion.
Yeah, wow.
I love her work.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many. When Tom was away last week, I did a sort of solo episode about Jamie Summers, someone whose style I'm not particularly into, and whose kind of approach I have some kind of interest, sort of I think her and I would have some differences of opinion, but like, it's so interesting about how many incredible artists you've interviewed, even, right? Like, you interviewed Jackie Gresham, who's incredibly interesting. You interviewed Vivian Logonza, who's just a phenomenal art. Like, you've been in the presence of some of the best tattoo artists of the last like 40 years.
It's true, and at the time, sometimes I was aware of their importance, and other times I was just thinking, this person is interesting
Yeah.
and, sort of satisfies one angle of this that I'm curious about. Funny thing about Jamie Summers is that here's a little tattoo world gossip. One of the women I interviewed, who I will not name, told me that she was convinced that Ed Hardy had Jamie Summers killed by a bus in New York. And I ran that by Ed Hardy once. I interviewed him. He was actually very cool for the first edition of the book.
Yeah.
He gave me a long interview, but I ran that by him, and I loved his reaction because he didn't seem at all outraged. He just was stumped. He said, like, how could somebody do that from the other side of the country? How do you direct a bus to kill someone on a public street? I don't think that happened.
Two of Ed's proteges within a year of each other both got hit by buses. Greg Irons got hit by a bus in Thailand. So maybe this is the conspiracy theory.
Yes, that may be it. But I will say, I think Ed Hardy, if anybody was going to have a female artist killed by a bus, it wouldn't probably be Ed Hardy, because he did help women.
Yeah. And he said that Jamie was the first person who understood what he was trying to do, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. And she was compatible with Ruth Martin because they were doing this experimental artistic stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I love this approach of like the kind of journalistic purity of it all. But I think what I've enjoyed about your work so much over the years is that I've read a lot of, obviously, like millions of pages of journalists from several centuries writing about tattooing, and it's often written with a real prurience and a real voyeurism and a real kind of like titillating edge. And tattooists, of course, have noticed that. And reading, one of the things I've been doing recently is reading a lot of tattoo artists talking to each other in trade magazines, and they often complain about journalists for a good reason. But your work, I think, stands almost uniquely, actually, as a work written by a non-tattooed person, but which doesn't have that kind of tone of prurience, of voyeurism, of like, you're a brilliant kind of historian as much as you are an amazing writer, I think. And I don't know whether that's conscious or whether it's because of the kind of politics of the project, but that's something that always struck me about your work.
Matt, I will I will say, and I was describing to someone earlier today, Margot was like, because a lot of people know I do this show but don't really understand what it's about, and they're like, I was saying like, oh, we're interviewing this very, very important writer, and they were like, oh, what did she do? And I was like, okay, imagine the Joan Didion of tattoo writing. So depending on your opinion of Joan Didion, that's a compliment.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I love her writing. And I sort of had to learn that. I think it does come out of being a journalist where you're interviewing people. A lot of people write about tattooing without talking to people in that world, or like just looking at what's already been written and making conclusions based on that. So interviewing people early on really helped. And it became clear that the women I was interviewing had really thought about what they were doing and were protective of what they were doing in some ways. And so I guess it's a little bit also a matter of being a feminist journalist or a feminist historian, where you have to get inside the perspective of the person you're interviewing and question yourself and your own assumptions. And it sort of carries through at the other end of my career in writing about Miss America, because I went into that project thinking, why are people still doing this? And this is such a bizarre ritual. And then starting to understand the often economic reasons that women were doing that with their bodies and, their lives. So I did come to understand it. I do think it's still really weird, and I'm surprised that it still exists, but I understand it better.
I mean, what were those first approaches you were making then to when you thought tattooing is the project I want to write about? Like, what were those first like letters, phone calls, conversations like?
It's a great question, and I'm not sure I remember like where I started. I may have started with history and gotten the information I could about like circus ladies and tattooed women in the early part of the 20th century. But I honestly don't know who I first approached. And there was a photographer who was helpful to me. I forget her name. I think Jill somebody, who gave me photos and knew a lot of the women she had photographed. So I wish I could answer that a bit more.
No, because I think, I mean, again, you still see it today with, academics who try and approach tattooing without any kind of empathy towards it. The initial approaches are often very clumsy and they're often very alienated. And I think those first approaches seem to actually define where these projects go, right? Because if you don't approach people, and tattooing is such, as you said there just there, like tattooing is such a kind of networked industry for good and for bad, that if you make the wrong first approach, you'll be persona non grata completely, right? So the first approach is very important, even if you don't, if you're not even aware of what you're getting yourself into, and you probably realize quickly afterwards, oh my god, I spoke to the right person or I spoke to the wrong person. I think like one of the ways that so many projects have gone badly from people from outside these industries have been when they've been writing about them is that they didn't approach them with any kind of humility or empathy. It was, as I said, with this kind of voyeurism. And it seems like, I mean, it's interesting to hear that you weren't even sort of strategic. It was just came from this genuine place of, I mean, it's obvious in the writing, I mean, but like it came from this genuine place of curiosity and interest in a way that wasn't off-putting to people who get kind of tell me about how weird you are questions like every day of the week.
Yeah, and it may have had to do with, like, linking to the title of the book, Bodies of Subversion, that I was interested in the way they were subverting traditional presentations of femininity.
Yeah.
And so I think that maybe that put people at ease because they understood that my interest in it was in their courage and their nerve in doing some of this at a time when it wasn't mainstream.
Yeah. And
but it was really exciting too that they were that was when women were like getting into the mainstream of the tattoo world and establishing their own styles and approaches.
Yeah, I think you make that point in the book, right? That there's something important about that moment in the 90s when women get to be not just tattooers who happen to be women, but they get to be, they get to work in a way that's distinctive and a way that is sort of defined by their individual work. Those artists that we've already listed work in quite overlapping but different stylistic ways. But they're not tokenistic. I mean, prior to that generation, you've got like one or two token women per generation, right? You've got the kind of curiosity of Millie Hull or Jessie Knight or whoever it might be.
Yeah, and it's tricky because you don't want to marginalize women and say, there's a world of male tattooists and then there's this subcategory. And it happens in so many realms. I've had this teaching English where a course we all teach at various points is women in literature. And I always have to say at the beginning of the class, do you all think there's a reason that we should have a special category for women in literature? Likewise, tattoo. I think at the beginning it really did matter. And I think it matters in that women do have specific approaches today, but there is some bad marginalization that goes on. I've been on some panels where like it was a whole series at, I guess it was at the Natural History Museum in LA, where the male tattooists were presented at the beginning of the series, in the early weeks. And the women tattooists and this was Carrie Barba and Rox, were at the end. And I remember Rox being kind of pissed off about that.
You're a brave fucking person to marginalize Carrie Barber and Rox. Like, Jesus Christ.
Exactly. Yeah. And
Carrie Barber's Instagram, by the way, is like one of my favorite Instagrams. Like she's just every day posting like absolutely wild, crazy stuff.
Yeah, and she's opening a museum now. Yeah. She's such a badass.
Yeah.
And she was, that was the first time I met her at that panel. The same thing happened once when I was on a morning TV show, the Katie Couric show with Stephanie Temez. Same thing. The men at the start, the whole episode was tattoo. The men at the start, big names. I forget who the biggest one was, but we were at the end. We didn't mind. We were having a good time, and it was kind of fascinating to be on national TV talking about tattooing, but same problem.
Yeah, I think I said totally. I think that's completely right. And I know, when I was doing stuff on Jessie, we did a little sort of separate mini exhibition on some of Jessie's collection, and Claudia de Sarbe, my friend from London, came and did some work with us, and she is very adamant that she doesn't want to be thought about, or pigeonholed or conceptualized as a female tattooist. She's just like, I am a tattooist, right?
Exactly. And there was somebody, I'm trying to remember who it was, who said, I don't want to do this because I don't want to be subcategorized. It was somebody good and well known, but I've lost the name.
It's a sort of constant battle. I mean, what I think has been interesting for the historiography, and this is like a sort of super niche and nerdy point, is that because your book is really one of a very small handful of like very well written, very well researched, very well approached books, there's actually much. This is what I found putting together my new project. Like, there's much more work, particularly because of your stuff on these marginalized groups, than there are actually on the center of the industry, because the center of the industry has been assumed to have been understood and written about. And actually, I think, like, that's not a criticism of your project at all, but it was my first introduction to this whole world, when I was 17, 18, when Bodies of Subversion came out, and I remember buying a copy, probably in 1998 or something. And and I was like, this is amazing, but I actually want to know the mainstream story, and that wasn't there either.
Right, yeah. So do you mean like tattoos, mastectomy tattoos, or women with Holocaust imagery by the margins? Is that what you're referring to?
But also, I mean the story of actually, weirdly, what the men were actually really up to as well, because actually the approach that you take is just as revelatory sometimes about the interesting stories and impacts and issues and influences of men in the industry as well, right? But yeah. And I think I was just reflecting on this. I sort of found myself, as I was rereading Bodies of Subversion recently, as I said, it was like, oh, I wish I'd had you write, like, not just about women, but that you'd gone and done this methodological approach and talked to about the wider industry per se, right?
Yeah, and I think I probably thought, as someone outside it, that I wasn't qualified to do the whole industry.
Right.
But it does interest me. I mean, like, I wrote an essay for the Los Angeles Review of Books about Ed Hardy's biography, and sort of jumped off
that
on
review.
Oh, thanks. That was fun in the sense that I could say, here's how he stands in the history of tattoo, and do a little mini version of that.
I mean, I remember when I was starting my when I was applying for my PhD in like 2005. People were sort of saying to me, like, this needs to be this sort of idea needs to be queer and more. We want to talk about gender, and we want to talk. And I was like, actually, to get to that, there's all this prior work that hasn't quite been done yet, And I feel I think people coming from outside, you sort of expect, I guess, or hope that the kind of work that you've done would have been done in a more mainstream way before you got to do the work just on women, and that wasn't quite the case,
Yeah, and I'm seeing a lot of great stuff from my students, because I teach a course. It's called Tattoos in Literature, Tattoos as Literature. So the first half of the course is reading novels and stories in which tattoos figure symbolically or however. And then the second half, we're looking at tattoo traditions around the world and like the sociology of tattoos. And for their final paper, they pick their research project. Sometimes they're just picking a traditional, like they love Japanese tattoo or they love Maori tattoo. But some of them are doing sort of sociological papers. And for example, one trans student did a piece on tattoos as expressions of gender affirmation in the trans community. Another student did this piece on Medusa tattoos, which I hadn't realized symbolized sexual assault. And she did this interesting flip where she wrote about the symbolism and how the imagery was presented, but also about people who had gotten Medusa tattoos without knowing this, they were coded this way. And even one guy a man who got the tattoo because he liked the image, but happened to have been sexually assaulted. So his tattoo was accidentally trumpeting this thing that he didn't intend to trumpet. And then he finally just came out and said, yes, both are true. I got this image because I like it, and I'm a victim of sexual assault. So it's great to see that stuff from them. Also students who are investigating their own history. Like I had a Puerto Rican student who was researching Taino tattoo, indigenous Caribbean cultural petroglyphs, and was so excited. She had a traditional Americana tattoo when she started the class, but at the end, she had found the image she would get that was from her own culture, which was exciting.
Yeah, and that's amazing. And I love how, again, one of the things I really have always appreciated about the way you approach things is you don't kind of culturally essentialize these things, right? Like you can talk about, well, maybe we can talk about the Olive Oatman project, because that's a good example. I think like the way you write about that story, there are many more clumsy ways to talk about that story, which reduce the tattooing to something very savage and primitive and reductive. But you approach that, I mean, it's a complicated story. You can explain to the listeners who haven't read the story like what the overview is, but you managed to write what is a very complicated historically gender and race history story in a very kind of empathetic and nuanced way. I mean, so do you want to quickly give an overview of the story for people that don't know it?
Hey, are you enjoying the show? If you really like Beneath the Skin and you want to help support us, you can do so on Patreon. For little as £5 a month, you can help make this show possible, help us buy research materials. So if you like the show and you want to support us, consider kicking us a few quid a month. And you'll get everything from bonus episodes to Q&As, and you can even vote on what tattoo I'll get when we reach a certain subscriber count. Matt, have you got anything to say?
You should really definitely fund the Patreon, because tattoo history is massive, right? Deep, wide, complicated. We're covering some big hit topics on the main feed, but on the Patreon subscriber-only feed, we'll be getting into some really more interesting, niche, deep topics you don't want to miss out on. And honestly, the chance to kind of decide what Thomas gets on his body is probably just a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Subscribe, chuck us a few quid. Don't miss out on this chance to ruin Thomas's body forever.
Sure, and we could come back to the question of centering a white woman in a story about Native Americans. So this it grew out of Bodies of Subversion because I was doing lectures at colleges on Bodies of Subversion, and somebody approached me and said, by the way, do you know about this woman? I didn't, and I went to my little local library here on the lower Hudson River and found her image in a book. I forget what the book was, but so she wasn't totally obscure. Then I started doing research, and so her story was that she was a white pioneer in the 1850s whose family traveled west, and when they got to what became Arizona in the Southwest, they were attacked by a tribe called the Yavapai. The whole family killed, Olive and her sister taken as basically slaves by this tribe for a little under a year. And then the Mojave, who traded with the Yavapai, came trading, saw the girls, felt sorry for them, traded for them, and took them back to their home on the sort of California-Arizona border, and raised them as their own. So the girls were, I think Olive was 13 when she left. Her sister was 7. Her sister died in a famine. And then 5 years later, 4 years after they were taken by the Mojave, they were ransomed back by the U.S. Army. One of their brothers had managed to survive this attack and had been looking for them. So it was a really sad story, and because she had lost her whole family and then found a second family with the Mojave and then was ripped from that family. And they didn't want to let her go because she was adopted as one of them. And some of my research in telling this story centered on the tattoo. She was they tattooed her on her chin and on with vertical lines on her a single vertical line on each upper arm. And so I did a little bit of investigative research and also interviewed Mojave elders who shed light on this. The tattoo was not, her story was presented as by a reverend who wrote about them after the fact.
Aren't they always? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And he was Methodist, so he completely purged the fact that this family was Mormon from the story. And, said, of course, God saved her, and it was only her faith in God that got her away from these horrible savages. But in fact, and claimed that she was a slave to them. But number one, they did not tattoo their captives. They had 2 other captives when she was with them who were not tattooed. And there were aspects of her story relating to a nickname she had, which was Sponsa, which translated as rotten vagina. And initially I thought, and some other researchers thought this meant like she may have been having her period when she was taken and they saw her. The Mojave were very clean because they swam in the Colorado River every day. They were great swimmers. And one of the elders told me that what the name really implied, and the Mojave loved body names and jokey names, was that she was having a lot of sex and that she was like worn out from all the sex she was having. So this elder, Mrs. Barrickman, said they would not have given this kind of a name to an outsider. It was a real insider kind of a thing. So the tattoo, the name, and also the fact that the tattoo is clean. So, well, also the 2 elders I interviewed said they never tattooed people against their will. The women in the tribe got the tattoo because it put them on an ancestral continuum in the afterlife so that you could recognize your ancestors when you got there. And it was like pretty cleanly done, which suggests she didn't struggle when she was tattooed. She probably was good with getting tattooed. Also, she didn't think she would ever be in the white world again. She thought her whole family was gone. So anyway, it was fascinating both because then when she was ransomed back, here she is, this Victorian lady in the 1850s and 60s with a chin tattoo. And she was really traumatized by these losses and told a couple of people she wanted to go back and see her Mojave family, which she never got to do. So, but going back to your question, it is true, and like that book has been optioned, and I'm sort of curious to see if it is.
Well, I was about to say that I'm sure if it hasn't, I was going to ask you if it's been optioned because it's the kind of thing that would make a fantastic film. Probably making a terrible film in the wrong hands, actually, I have to say.
Exactly. And there have been a few. There have been a few like minor films that they don't. I guess they're probably terrible in the sense that they don't tell the whole story. They don't sort of tap into all there is, like that. Well, the period that.
I think because there's a few chapters in Painted People where again that book was very much in my mind, like particularly the chapter about Fiji, which we talked about actually on the podcast about Adi Lebaleba and Baron von Hugel in Fiji. If you view that European white indigenous tattoo exchange as one of savage appropriation or savage brutality, you end up missing all the actual nuance and information and index and humanity that a more careful, more kind of contextualized telling of those exchanges can tell. Like if you understand the story of like tattooing in the Pacific or tattooing in the Americas as one of white people's skin being kind of ruined by savage technology, which is the story that people have often told, you don't understand what's really going on in those moments of exchange, right? That are much more complicated and nuanced than history tends to record. I mean, I talked a lot about this, but I'm really struck by after the into the 19th century, really, how the the kind of colonial politics of tattooing changes very rapidly in line with kind of dominant colonialist ideas about the body. And I feel like what I loved about the Blue Tattoo, the book we're talking about, is that you acknowledge all this nuance and complexity, right, by contextualizing it.
And the context is so interesting in the history of this nation, because there was this change happening when they were when first of all when they were traveling west, but also in the period when she was with the Mojave. It was just after the Mexican-American War, so something like, I think, 60% of Mexico had been ceded to the United States. So the geographical borders were shifting under her feet. And then there are these culture clashes between the Mexicans who had been on land that was Mexico, the indigenous people who had been there forever, and then the white pioneers pushing west into all this with no idea what they were getting into. Like, they were using guidebooks written by people who'd never been there that told them, you're going to a beautiful grassy, tree-lined, gladed landscape where, it will be paradise. And in fact, it was the desert. It wasn't anything like that. So those cultural things are interesting. But also it is tricky. I noticed, like, when I was interviewing these Mojave elders and saying, partly trying to clarify, there was a rumor that she had a husband and children, which almost certainly she did not with the Mojave. And they were able to clarify that. But I was struck by the fact that they said, like, we would know. It's not that many generations back. They were in their 80s at the time. So they would have known. And to the white population, I mean, she was a celebrity and she lectured, and people were fascinated by both her story and because she had a tattoo on her face. So she was much more significant to white people who had having gone west and become a, quote, white Indian, than she was to the Mojave, for whom she was just somebody who passed through for a few years. Yeah. She wasn't like a big significant figure.
And those lenses are things that, again, I think in general we're quite bad at. We culturally are quite bad at doing. I mean, what was? I want to ask you on that as well. Like, what your response was from publishers when you were approaching them with Bodies of Subversion, with Blue Tattoo. Like, did you have to kind of hard sell it? Did they want you to make it more prurient and more? Either of those two projects, both of them? Like, what were those conversations of trying to make those books happen? Because, again, we've talked recently on the podcast about, and these are some of the framing devices in my next book, about some books that were proposed in the 60s and then in late 60s and late 70s about tattooing. And I've had some of these conversations myself with, like, publishers and documentary makers about, people, gatekeepers to these worlds. They want particular kinds of stories that are prurient, that are, leaning into the tropes that you've done so well to subvert, pardon the pun. So I've always been interested in what those conversations were like when you were trying to get those projects off the ground.
Well, with Bodies of Subversion, I don't think I felt that with either book. Bodies of Subversion was initially published by research publications who did the Modern Primitive series. And so Andrea Juno, who was the publisher and my editor, was very minimally intrusive.
Yeah, I guess pitching to Vale and Juno is a different kind of conversation, right?
Right. Yeah.
I've met Vale a couple of times.
Yeah, actually, I've never met him. I know they split off into different companies, but I actually don't know what happened to Andrea Juno. I've lost track.
No, I don't actually.
But with the Blue Tattoo, what's interesting was that my literary agent tried to sell it and couldn't. And then I approached University of Nebraska, and they were great. They wanted it. And I don't remember any, like, unwelcome meddling in terms of the tone or anything like that. But it's funny to me that that's the book that was the hardest sell, that sells the most. Like, it just keeps going. And, like, every couple of months, there's somebody on YouTube or TikTok doing a big Olive Oatman segment, often plagiarized from my
Yeah.
book. There's one that's actually an AI generated woman who has transformed the book into the whole text into the first person.
No.
So like everything I've written, she's saying, I did this, I went there, the culture was like this, I thought that. And so it's like a new realm of AI plagiarism.
Oh
that
God. I got plagiarized. You know, I got plagiarized by a real person. And you got plagiarized by a robot. I don't know which is worse.
I know, and the problem is you can't go like with AI. You can't really go after the source of the plagiarizer. But I tell my students about your plagiarism story, and they're always properly outraged by that.
Don't give them any ideas, Marco.
I know. Well, it's kind of a good lesson because I'm always going on about plagiarizing in the writing and then saying to them, A, there are other kinds of plagiarism. B, ideas can be plagiarized, not just words or images.
Oh, and I wanted to let Tom come in here, but I wanted to also ask you, like, because it happened, I even do it sometimes. Why is it that two of the best books about tattooing of the early 21st century are both written by women called Margot? Like,
it's a funny thing.
Do you get confused with Margot de Mello all the time?
You know, it has never really happened. I remember when her book came out, it was called Bodies of Inscription. Yeah. It sort of stopped me. I thought, But she did good research.
Yeah.
I reviewed that book also for the Village Voice. It's kind of ancient history now. I should go back and read it, but I don't know how that happened.
It's funny.
It's strange.
There's the whole, I was reading that book by Naomi Klein, Doppelganger, about how she's always confused now for Naomi Wolf. And like she has to kind of constantly, because they're both, middle-aged East Coast women with long, auburn hair, called Naomi.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a really interesting book, actually. And I feel like there's a version of Doppelganger, not that you and Margot de Mello are as different as Naomi Klein and Naomi Wolf are. But I know when I've been doing bibliographies my whole career, I've always been like, no, I also, because one of you don't spell your name with a T, do you? And she does, or the other way around. No, you have the T. She doesn't. I do. You have the T. She doesn't have the. She doesn't have the T. Yeah. So this is my constant bibliographic issue of like the two Margos.
It's strange, but they're sort of complementary books because hers is more straight sociology and mine is more journalistic. And I think hers more historical.
A little bit of history. Yeah. I actually think yours is better historically than hers is in terms of the how much it stood up to the test of time in terms of how much it makes sense. But they're both important books, and she's done things since as well. She did an interesting kind of encyclopedia project called Inked, or I think it's called. But I always thought that was funny. It's not that common a name, Margot, right? And then not that many good books in my professional opinion on this stuff, and two of them are written by women called Margot.
Yeah, that is strange. I also love Marisa Kekoulis's books.
Oh yeah,
the like black tattoo art, those big, really beautiful books.
Yeah, I've known Marisa since I was like 21 years old. Like I've known her for so long. Like she's such an old friend of mine, and like what an incredible. I mean, she's her sort of like getting more involved in child law is a real loss to the tattoo industry.
I know, and she's I guess works for the Department of Education, but she has done great stuff on tattoo copyright. Too.
Yeah,
which is important.
And her books that she did, those big sort of surveys with Edition Royce, are just masterful. They take up too much room on the shelf, but
I know. Well, I kind of like the size. I like to my visual culture tattoo books are downstairs, but sometimes I like to. For a while at the beginning of COVID, when I was in this office teaching on Zoom, I hauled up her books just to put them on my shelf because they were so beautiful.
Give you a workout. Tom, have you read Bodies of Subversion?
I have. I was going to ask. I'll bring it back to Joan Didion because, as people know, on this show, I am the extremely pretentious one. Margot, for a bit of background, I also have a journalistic background, and two of my, I suppose, favorite journalists are Joan Didion and Werner Herzog. Paul King is like dying in his seat right now. We recently went on a trip to Switzerland, and Paul hates Werner Herzog, and me and Matt were torturing him with Werner Herzog impressions. But I wanted to ask you about, like, I think your work is so great in terms of like contextualizing disparate factors of kind of one thing, kind of creating nodes between different stories. And I kind of look at it as, creating context around observable objects. In Bodies of Subversion is creating context around, not necessarily objectivization, but the observable object of female bodies and tattooing. And same with Olive Oatman as a kind of historiographical object. And I haven't read your beauty pageant book yet, but I will. But like about intentionally becoming an observable object, I want to ask about your approach towards when you're thinking about these subjects. How do you, I suppose, conceptualize what is the bigger truth around these stories?
Yeah, I get what you mean. Like with Bodies of Subversion, it was a question of both why are people doing this and what do they get from it and how does it compare? I guess like the feminist foundation of it is always there of how does it compare to what men do? How are they bold or innovative in making it their own? And then like with the Olive Oatman story, that's a little different because it's one narrative. It's not a whole cultural thing, although it plugs into circus ladies who used her story as a template for their own stories, dramatic stories of having been captured by wild Indians. And here are my tattoos, which of course are like all this Americana that indigenous people would not have put on somebody in their tattooing. So some of that was about understanding, more in an individual sense, what could this have been like for this person? And she's in some implicit way heroic because of all she went through. Not that she set out to say, I'm going to be a hero, but the fortitude and also the sort of elasticity of her life, her ability to adapt in the ways that she did, and then to come back and start another life. And she was married to a man who himself had been an Indian captive. So that was more linear. But just getting back to your question, I guess maybe looking for Miss America is a better way to answer it. Going in wanting to understand why do these women do this, but then having to do a sociological and an economic examination of it, because I didn't realize going in how much of it is about class and money, trying to grab onto something that's going to get you a step up in life. Mid-century, beauty pageant winners got a sort of social status that propelled them into a higher stratum of society. There's always that question.
And I suppose as well as an add-on question to that, like how do you interrogate kind of yourself or do some form of introspection when approaching these subjects? Because I'm sure, like you said earlier, when you look at like looking for Miss America, everyone will have preconceived notions about, well, why do these women do this? And I'm sure you had the same thing with Bodies of Subversion and the blue tattoo.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what was your thought process when initializing that process, but also throughout it as well?
Yeah, and it does in both of those books, it does have to do with being aware of your preconceptions. Like with Bodies of Subversion, I saw a lot of really ugly tattoos. And I kind of had to, curb my snobbery because the project wasn't about finding beautiful tattoos to talk about. The project was understanding why people get what they get. And it segues perfectly with cosmetic surgery. I feel like I have to, if I'm going to say women through tattoo are redefining their bodies and presenting themselves the way they want to, I have to say the same with people who are completely cosmetically reconstructed.
It's so funny you said that because I was about to mention or ask you if you'd ever met Victoria Pitts Taylor because she's at CUNY in New York. And
yeah, I never did meet her.
And she her approach when she wrote her books, in fact plural, on cosmetic surgery was to go in with not exactly a kind of fixed set of preconceptions, but but with a really open mind to examine what she thought she understood, and she didn't find what she thought she was going to find. in terms of the narratives, in terms of the context. And the Surgery Junkies book, which is her sort of big magnum opus on this, is exactly that same process that you describe. And I think, again, one of the reasons why I've always enjoyed her writing as well is it is willing to examine those preconceptions. I mean, I think like there's a lot of writing still about women and tattooing, both before Bodies of Subversion and afterwards. Uh, the stuff afterwards always cites you and seems to be doesn't generally understand what you were trying to do, because so much of the literature on women and tattooing from sociology and psychology is really reductive. It's really like it's about pain, or it's about self-actualization, or it's about X or Y. And I think actually the real lesson for me from your work, and actually Victoria Pitts Taylor's work about plastic surgery at the same time, is that like actually it's not about one thing. It's actually kind of complicated, and the indexicality and the meaning production is probably more interesting than trying to decipher a kind of root, like why.
Once again, Matt, it's Joan Didion. It all comes back to Joan Didion.
Yeah, and the why. I mean, with the Miss America book, I definitely went into that with a snobby kind of why. Like the implication was these people are nuts, but if I'm interested enough to explore it, I have to understand their perspective. And I realized they're not nuts. I mean, a few of them are.
Yeah,
pretty
a few of them probably nuts. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
so
a lot of people would have written the They're Nuts book, like.
Yes. And that would be dull. Like when I was writing the proposal, I realized nobody needs to have a meditation on what's wrong with beauty pageants. It's more interesting to find what's interesting. And now that I think about it, they do connect, like Bodies of Subversion and the beauty pageant book, in the sense, like going back to Tom's question, that the themes that motivated people overlapped a lot, like history of sexual abuse, and wanting to tattoo over the body to reclaim the body, or with beauty pageants feeling bad about the body and violated and wanting to be celebrated for beauty in the wake of that. Those themes definitely connect.
And I actually think, it is possible to get closer to answers to questions like what is wrong with beauty pageants or what is wrong with tattooing if you approach it with that more open-minded, more kind of nuanced and more like methodologically precise set of approaches. Because again, like, I write about pornography as well, right, for similar reasons. And again, there's plenty wrong with pornography, but the way that most academics have approached that, and certainly most journalists have approached that question, is super reductive, because they know what they want to say before they even do the thinking. And I think probably, I said, I'm looking forward to reading your new book, because it strikes me that I would get a sense about what's wrong with pageants, even if that's not the kind of didactic message of the writing.
Mm-hmm. And it changes through history. Like in the early 20th century, the first half, beauty pageants were one of the only platforms for women to advance. They didn't have the kind of opportunities they have now. So it's more understandable then. And it was also more fun then, in the sense that the glamour and the nice fashion was there. Now it's like the fashion is a little prom dressy and just not glamorous.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting in the sense of, like, if you look at, I suppose, the bookends of your published work of two diametrically opposed ends of female beauty standards, of what is the furthest subversion you can do out of, and at the time it was heavily tattooed female bodies, and now it's like the inherently extremely conventional beauty standards as upheld by these competitions as well. I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, and there's a funny intersection between those two themes, which is the great Betty Broadbent, the circus performer, who I forget if it was the 40s, she competed in a beauty contest at the World's Fair in New York. And I just love that story, because she knew there was no way she was going to win, but she just got out there and gave it her all.
Yeah, it's an interesting intentional statement. And I suppose, like, my last question would be, I think your work combines both like journalistic writing with a kind of phenomenological study of like to go back to Herzog, to try and get that like sublime truth that like exists just beyond, outside of the perimeter of facts. It's like these things are provably true with facts and evidence, but they mean something more when you kind of take a little skewed look at it. And as someone who's so incredible at what you do, what do you see people do wrong, and what would your advice be for people undertaking these sorts of projects? Because I see a lot of books attempting to try and do what you've done about a variety of different subjects, but it's kind of, as someone who's done it so well, what's your advice or critique?
That's a good question. I think it's people writing as fans, which can be fine. It can be great, but too many people write as fans and therefore don't have a critical approach to what they're doing, and it just becomes, this artist is great, this artist is great, this tattooed person is great, and that's it. It's like a coffee table book mentality.
It's a bit too emphatic.
Yeah. And also, I actually stopped reading most tattoo magazines because I just found most of them to be pretty low content and also, at worst, just appallingly sexist. And a number of the women I interviewed said at some point they quit. And I know like there have been some attempts to publish more inclusive, forget the name of, there was one for a while that was
Tattoo Advocate that Shotzi Gorman did in the early 90s, I think, is probably the best example of that. It didn't last very long, but I think he explicitly set out to try and write a kind of anti-tattoo magazine.
Yeah, those were great. And also Ed Hardy's Tattoo Time series, MAGA books. But the commercial magazines, there was one, I think it might have had Show in the name, that was, there was a female editor who was consciously trying to make it better, but it didn't. I don't think it survived. And actually, there are a few now that are published by women that are nice. They're not sort of indulging in the historical sexism that has plagued this industry.
Just lots of new modern forms of sexism.
Yeah, right. It's reinvented all the time.
Can I ask you one final thing? Because I wanted to ask you specifically about Jessie Knight, another a woman whose collection and whose family are close to my heart now. I managed to convince the British government to buy her stuff and save it for the nation as an art historically important collection. But
oh wow,
I first read about Neil, who I then contacted for my exhibition, and which led to the dominoes that fell in the second edition of Bodies of Subversion. And I, as far as I know, you were the first person to interview him about Jessie. She'd been mentioned a few times in a few kind of niche tattoo books, but I want to ask you like how your engagement with Neil and with Jessie came about, because again, just from a very selfish point of view, that was a really well-timed dot for me in terms of what happened afterwards for me. I managed to get in touch with Neil, and he said the thing that all historians want to hear, which is, oh yeah, I've got a few things in the loft,
Oh right, yeah.
And then now nearly all of that collection, over 1,000 objects, is at the National Museum of Wales out in Cardiff, causing beautiful headaches for the conservation team. But yeah, so how did, because you obviously your interview work in the 90s was largely American. Like, how did the British side come about when you were thinking about the re-release?
It must have been newspaper articles. I can't quite remember how I got started, but I contacted him on social media.
Yeah.
And it was so great because then he just sent me this flood of images.
Oh, yeah.
It was like Christmas.
Yeah,
I couldn't believe it.
Yeah.
And then I guess I interviewed him, or it may have been that he sent me all this after I'd written about her and was looking for images for the book. But it has kind of receded into history. I can look it up, though. I know I have the emails.
Because again, I just thought it was it was one of those stories, and I think that's true of a lot of the stories in Bodies of Subversion, that was sort of right there for the telling, and just no one had bothered to really turn those stones over. And I'd heard about Jessie, of course, in passing, but reading that in the second edition was like, oh, Neil's out there, and I also then tracked it on social media, and actually that the revelation of his collection through the exhibition that we did, like, has led in part to the explosion of the tattoo collecting market, because some of the stuff that was sold before we saved it went for a lot of money and has sort of driven up prices all over the place. So I feel like you're sort of responsible in a root way for the craziness of the tattoo collecting market right now.
Oh, that's interesting. I was not aware of it, and I'm really happy for Jesse Knight to get that
Yeah.
recognition.
Yeah.
I think about the first edition of Bodies of Subversion. It amazes me to think now that I couldn't use digital resources. People were
Right.
faxing me images or sent, I had to go to collections. I had to use microfiche to comb through newspapers. It was very time consuming.
Yeah. Well, I definitely couldn't do. I mean, I was starting out just at the beginning of the internet era. Like, I still use some card catalogs right at the beginning of my career, but they went away very quickly. The kind of work that I've done in my career, and increasingly with digital research, like, I am just so in awe of people like you who were doing all of that amazing work without the digitized resource. I mean, and it's why actually so much of the stuff that we've learned about all of these characters and the depth of the history, it's the stuff that you never would find with any conventional non-digital research methodology. Like, we just couldn't have found it. And I think, I try and when I do talks, I was in Las Vegas a few weeks ago talking with Paul King about Ethel Granger, the woman with the world's smallest waist, that Paul King just did a book about. But trying to explain to like 20-year-olds, and I'm sure you have this with your students, I have it with mine, that like, you can't just Google this. This is like years and years of like luck and relationship building and asking the right questions and knowing what you're looking for. And the research that comes together for these projects is just mind blowing. And I think again, when I started out, I mean, when I started out, I was like, I'm really interested in tattooing. What can I read about? And I literally, honestly, I think I did just find like a couple of books, and yours was one of them. And I was like, oh, this is possible. It looks very difficult. It looks very difficult. But again, of course, at the time, I wasn't aware of how complicated this all is.
It's true. And there's something I have to tell you about your book. I assigned my students the Joe Carstairs
wonderful
chapter, because someone in the class said, like, I don't feel like we're doing enough queer tattoo history. And I had just read the books. It was perfect timing. But I wanted to tell you that it sort of hit home in another sense, which was my older sister, who is kind of a pioneer herself, who was in the first class of women at Yale, and then was a pioneering sports writer, like one of the first female sports writers in New York. When she was a kid, running around the neighborhood with her gang, she made an announcement that from there on, everybody should call her Joe.
Yeah.
Her name was Laurie. And she enjoyed that. And like, I'm sure it brought her some authority. I'm sure she sensed that was going to boost her authority. And I'm not exactly sure how long it went on for, but it was a while.
She probably didn't have the luxury of being like one of the richest people in the world and had a private army. So she probably wasn't as effective as it was for Joe Carstairs.
Yes, exactly. Her story is so great, though. All those stories, I mean, I'm sure everybody who listens to your podcast has your book, Painted People, on their shelves. If they don't, they should. But what I love about that book is the narrative. Like it's the story is what drives the ideas, and it's so well done in that book, and it's irresistible.
I really, really appreciate that. I was when you reviewed it, I was like a kid at Christmas, really, because it was, as I've made it abundantly clear. I have been an enormous fan of you since the minute I picked your book up when I was sort of 18 years old, and you continue to be an inspiration to me today.
Well, thank you so much, and likewise.
Try and live up to the lessons that you've taught.
Oh, thanks. Well, I'm looking forward to your next book.
Thank you.
I'll
definitely send you a copy, and I think it's it's trying to do again what you do so well, which was have a lot of history, a lot of research, a lot of seriousness, but in a way that is hopefully readable and interesting on its own merits. I think I think that's one of the things that is difficult to do, is write detail in a way that isn't alienating to people that aren't involved in, as you said, like trying to avoid writing as a fan. I think is a really, really great lesson.
Yeah, and you make a point in that book that I find useful in my class. I forget the exact line, but stating that tattoos are a kind of written text on the body to be read, like a text.
Yeah, tattoos are a medium, not a phenomenon. Is the sort of headline version of that? Yeah.
Listen, thank you so much, Margot, for talking to us. It's frankly an honor. If anyone wants to read any of your work or maybe enroll in one of your classes, where can they find you?
Such a joy to talk to you both. I really appreciate it.
And what's next? So what's next? What are you working on next? If you're allowed to say.
I can. It does relate to women's history. It's a joint biography of two radical Quaker abolitionists of the early 19th century. So it's in proposal form now. So it probably won't be a book for years, but it's great fun. And I was raised Quaker. So these women are Quakers and sort of can be traced on my family line, although my father was adopted. But what's fun about that is that going back to the subversion theme, people think of Quakers as quaint people who wear black, but they were quite radical in the early 19th century in terms of abolition, pacifism, all kinds of reform, suffragism.
Marcus Rediker, the historian of slavery, wrote an amazing book about a Quaker man with dwarfism called Benjamin Lay. I have it up here. Who's from basically where I live right now, from my university. So he came over, was doing some research. We had him at the university. Yeah, the radical Quaker. I mean, he was. For listeners, this book is called The Fearless Benjamin Lay, the Quaker Dwarf, and he was like making prop Bibles, filling them with beetroot juice and pulling them out, like sticking his knife through the Bible and watching it bleed and holding it up in church, saying slavery makes the Bible weep. This sort of performance art stuff.
He was the Nan Golden of his era, doing performative protest.
Yeah,
he was amazing. And there was somebody else, a Quaker called the Public Universal Friend.
Yes, incredible story.
Yeah, proto-trans Quaker activist. Yeah. Really interesting.
I'd forgotten that they were Quaker, the Public Universal Friend. Mm-hmm. Incredible.
Yeah, I think they were like borderline Quaker and shifted into something more evangelical later in life, but interesting story.
So what are the subjects of your book, so we can get excited about it? What are they called?
So the book title or So the book is called Sister Suffragettes, and now I'm forgetting the subtitle. So like the epic story of a abolitionist family or something.
Wow.
Sister Suffragettes is the way to remember it. That'll probably stick.
Fantastic.
Margot, thank you so much for coming on the show, and thank all of you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to hear more, check us out on Patreon for as little as £3 a month. You can get extra episodes and episodes like this early. As always, the web shop is down below, and we will be at London Tattoo Expo in September. So if you want some absolutely sick Greg Irons flash provided by the Greg Irons Archive, we will have some of our friends tattooing it with us in the booth, and you can also come and have a chat with me and Matt. But until then, it's goodbye from me.
Bye.